Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at some intermediate HTML. That intermediate term is sort of arbitrary. It just indicates that we're looking at some more sophisticated concepts in HTML. Specifically in this video, we are going to revisit some older topics, focusing on semantic elements, some navigation, and some code reuse. And specifically, what we want to do is we want to start off thinking about how can we write our web pages in more of a sustainable manner. And so I'd like for us real quick to revisit this concept of the semantic elements. And specifically, you'll notice that we talked about some of the elements that could be used multiple times, perhaps over multiple pages, or a particular element within a page that may be modular that could be potentially reused. Now, we're going to cover that second scenario in a later video. In this video, I want to focus mainly on the navigation element. The idea being is that you might have multiple pages and you'd like to have the same navigation menu across multiple pages. Now, in the earlier video, we already talked about one way of doing this, and that would just simply be to manually copy and paste your navigation menu between your HTML pages. And, well, I suppose that's fine if you've only got a few pages and you never intend on making any sort of changes between those pages, because you'll have to remember to make all those changes on all of those pages. But what we want to do is we want to make something a little more sophisticated. Now, in another video, we talked about two particular elements, an iframe, and then not in a video, another element, an older style element called the embed element that allows for you to bring in HTML from another document into your page. And so the idea is that it would offer you sort of a window into code reuse. There, of course, are other reasons that you would use the iframe and the embed elements, but we're going to focus mainly on that. Mainly because the other uses of those elements are pretty obvious. In other words, if you want to embed a video or an image in your web page, not using the traditional tags, but maybe there's some other functionality that you want to have along with it, maybe a media player or something along those lines, then the iframe and the embed are sort of your only options. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a more sophisticated, more sleek, perhaps arguably even a little sneakier use of some of those additional elements. And that is to be able to create a reusable navigation bar. Now, the other link on the W3 Schools page I'd like to remind you about is this how-to on various different types of navigation bars. In an earlier page, in an earlier video, we kept it simple. We're not going to do any sort of behavior. We're just going to be looking at the styling, and then a couple of links associated with the navigation bar. So if you've not yet gone through this example, I would encourage you to go ahead and do it before you move forward with this video. Now, I've sort of cheated a little bit, and what do I mean by that? And that I've already provided you with some of the HTML. I'll figure out a way to put this on the GitHub so that you don't have to necessarily copy all of this from screenshots. But the idea is that this essentially goes back and revisits one of our earlier videos where we created this navigation menu at the top of our pages. Now, again, these are very, very simple pages. I didn't even want to focus on the content of the page, but rather the structure of having multiple pages. So you can see here that I have from our earlier example, just a navigation menu with a bunch of links followed by an H1 and a P tag, nothing fancy at all. And if you want a quick reminder of what that one looked like, well, we can just pull it up in our web browser. Sorry, wrong link. We'll go with this one. And you can see it's really not all that interesting, right? In other words, just H1 and P tag and then the links up top. Now, if you recall from the earlier video and the earlier discussion, we basically had to copy and paste this little snippet of code across multiple pages. And then if we made a change, we had to remember to make that change in all of them. What I'm proposing is an alternative to that. And what I mean by that is, let's say that we could push just the code associated with the navigation menu into a separate HTML file. And in this case, I've got all of the additional tags, the body, the head, and the HTML tags. But we're going to focus just on the navigation elements. And Basically, what I've done here is I've created a slightly more sophisticated example with another set of HTML files. Home is now, of course, home underscore O2, examples O2, and so on. And the idea here is that in my navigation pane, I would have the links to my primary pages on my site. And the idea is that perhaps there would be additional pages below each of these main pages, but this is just your high-level navigation for your website. And you'll notice here also too that I have my target set as the parent. You can, of course, if you want to open it in a new tab, you can. That's also another option. But I just kept this one very, very simple. And the idea then is that I would take this navigation underscore o2.html, which is an absolutely silly name long term, but I would take this and I would somehow include it inside of each of my additional HTML pages. So for instance, you'll now see that I'm looking at my home underscore o2.html. Again, not a very interesting page. As a matter of fact, we could take just a second to pull it up and you can see that it isn't any different than the previous one. The only difference is with this one is that this navigation menu up here is no longer just simply hard-coded in the HTML file associated with home underscore O2. Rather, what I've done is I've played a little sneaky trick, excuse me, where I've used an iframe. And for that iframe, I've got the source being the navigation underscore o2.html and a couple of other attributes set, particularly no scrolling, no frame border, and my width and my height is what I've set to make it look decent. But you'll notice here now that it pulls the contents from the navigation underscore o2.html into the iframe, and it handles it as if it is a completely separate document within the document. However, though, what that gets you is that you can now carry that single line of code into each of your other main landing pages. So here you'll see I have my examples underscore o2.html. Again, not a very fancy page, perhaps even poorly named. And I also have my about underscore o2.html. Excuse me. Now, the goal here is that instead of having to remember to update each of these pages, when I decide that I want to add an additional navigation link, I would simply go back to my navigation underscore o2.html and I would make whatever other changes that I wanted to make. I would simply make it here in our navigation underscore o2.html. Now, before we make any changes, I want you to see exactly how this is going to work here. And so I can come up here, I can now select home and it'll just take me to my home page. Select examples, it'll take me to my examples page. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here just so it's a little easier for you to see. And of course, my about. And then the same thing is true here. I'll just zoom in a little bit. Now, the idea here is that if I wanted to make a change, let's say that I wanted to go back and have something similar to what we did with our initial home underscore 01, where I have my additional link here to UAB, I'll just simply copy. I'll come over here to my navigation and I will paste this in here. I'll save it. And then we'll come over here now and I will go back to my home and you'll see that now I have an additional link here. And you'll notice that it's trying to take me to UAB's website within the iframe. Now, we've already talked about this, why that particular trick won't work. I'm showing you this in this particular example so you can also understand one of the advantages of the embed element versus the iframe element. You've got a number of things that you've got to worry about or concerns that you want to have. But what you have here is a nice ability to otherwise have links associated with a single site in an iframe to be able to act as a reusable navigation pane. Now, that is not the only way that you can go about doing that. As a matter of fact, let's go back here and let's go ahead and take this out since we know that this particular modification won't quite work. But the main thing to note is that you can, in fact, make changes. As a matter of fact, what we can do here, we can just make this change back. And you can see here, I appear to have saved my navigation. I'll go back here, I'll refresh this one more time, and you can see now that basically those changes have now been propagated to each of the pages. And then while we're at it, before we leave this and before we talk about any other options, we can of course look at the code behind, just doing a Control U. And you can see here that basically what I'm doing is I'm leveraging this navigation underscore o2.html to be able to navigate to each of the pages. Now, going back to our options, when we take a look at this navigation menu, it turns out there are actually a couple of other possibilities. Number one, you'll notice here a slight tweak on this concept, same concept, just with a slight change, is that we can also use a div and then a class attribute. In this case, we've classed it as navigation. What does this get you? Well, it just allows for you to style it based on the navigation class versus having a nav element. Again, there's a couple of different possibilities you can go do with this. I'm going to give you the source code, so I'm going to encourage you to play with both. Currently, they function almost exactly the same. And then the other two main options that you have when it comes to this is having a templating system that will essentially glue all the pieces or the HTML snippets together into one HTML file. This will usually be handled by some sort of content management system that we'll talk about in later videos. And of course, another option is to have your HTML dynamically generated, which we will also cover in later videos when we start talking about server side options, and for that matter, even asynchronous options where you're communicating back with a server for the purposes of dynamically creating HTML for your client. But if you want to keep it simple, but also have some code reuse, one of the easiest things to do is to simply put some of your code into a separate HTML file and then simply include it in your HTML, into your main HTML, by simply having either an iframe or the embed tag. Now, before we leave this topic, we want to talk a little bit about some of the advantages and disadvantages of the iframe versus the embed. And the main thing is the iframe gives you a little extra security. There is some more flexibility with the iframe. The embed was sort of a little bit of an older approach. It bypasses some of those security concerns, so you just want to be aware of that. We'll have to see if they ultimately end up deprecating the embed tag or not. That may or may not be a possibility in the future, but it gives you a couple of different ways now to reuse some of your HTML, even without going the dynamic route or the templating route. So hopefully you found this video useful. Again, I'll figure out a way to get these code snippets to you. There's nothing sophisticated about them. I would encourage you to apply them to your own portfolio, to your own documents, so that you can see exactly how they would work. And, again, try to keep this particular example simple. But as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.